Hello, my name is James Arroyo, and welcome to Chapter 8, Developing and Maintaining Relationships. We've previously discussed what communication is in total, and we've been discussing public speaking. Now we're going to be developing into what interpersonal communication is, as well as what group communication is. And by better understanding how we interact with others, it will help us improve the quality of those interactions. So let's go ahead and dive right on in. To why. Why learn about managing relationships? Well, when we learn how to manage them, our relationships will last longer and be more fulfilling. In fact, a very interesting study talked about happiness and what it is that makes us happy. And guess what? It is how good our relationships are in our lives. And that even is accounting for economic disparity as well as overall life situation. It's the relationships is what makes us most happy. We also have more success in the business world if we're better able to have relationships or manage relationships in person. Then we're going to be better able to manage relationships in business as well. Also, we'll be better able to understand multiple viewpoints of those who we disagree with by being able to better manage those relationships and therefore learn from them. And it will also we will have more clear communication and more productive conflict with relationships that are more positive. So, let's talk about interpersonal relationships. What are they? They are the interconnections and interdependence between two individuals. So let's break that down. Interconnectedness means that what one person does affects the other, and what one person does affects the other. So we are affected by each other. We are connected in a certain way. And then there's also interdependence, that we depend on each other to gain certain needs. There are things that we cannot do on our own. We cannot. Uh, we can't do a lot of things on our own. One example would be for me, I personally don't like going to the movie theaters on my own, and I like to have friends who would like to go do that with me. Also, video games. I don't like playing video games on my own. I like to have, or especially certain video games, more party video games. I wouldn't be able to do that without a relationship of some kind. We also have that in business. We have that in romantic relationships. There's a lot of romantic relationship behaviors that we wouldn't be able to do on our own. I'll just leave it there. So there's a lot of things that we can gain with interpersonal relationships, and we manage this through interpersonal communication. This is the exchange of verbal and nonverbal messages between two people who have a relationship. This involves there are many different types of interpersonal communication: family, friendship, and social relationships, romantic relationships, and online relationships are those types. Let's break it down. We start with family. Family is the most basic relationship and our main source of social learning. We learn a great deal of how we should interact with the world, as well as what is effective and appropriate to communicate in the world. We also learn interests, expectations, things like that. So we have constant communication, and there are many more interpersonal communication dynamics revolving families, especially how structured or free they are. But in general, families we just learn a great deal from. They are our main source of social learning. Next, we have friendships and social relationships. And this can span across multiple types of relationships. Social relationships being those acquaintances that we have, where we may not be as interconnected or as interdependent, versus those friendships, those ride or die friendships, those ones that are very meaningful to us. And these are based in there's many permutations across friendships. Just think of two different friendships that you have with two different groups and how they are similar. or sorry, and think about what sort of distinctions there are. There may be quite a few. And there are many different types of friendships. There's short-term and long-term. There are those ones that last a summer. There are those that last a lifetime. Task versus maintenance. Maybe you're designed to achieve a certain task, and that friendship might be just until that task is over. Versus maintenance oriented, where the act of communicating with each other is the goal of that friendship and not a task specifically. We also have high and low disclosure friendships where we don't disclose as much or we disclose a ton. Also, we have high versus low obligation friendships where one person dis, uh, may feel obligated to invite that friend to everything that they do, versus another friend may not feel as obligated in that situation. And then we have frequent versus infrequent contact friendships. There are friends that I contact every single day because guess what? We see each other every single day. Versus those who maybe have left town and are living somewhere else, they still are great friends for me. So there's many different types of friendships, and as long as they are interconnected and interdependent in some way, shape, or form, then the friendship can still occur. Next, we jump into romantic interpersonal relationships, and these are defined by love and intimacy. Who do we love? We can love family, we can love friends, we can love romantic partners. So, love isn't in and of itself, it's only the only thing that romantic relationships are defined by. There are many different types of love, and this is a further communication of that. We have eros, which is erotic and sexual love. That's a part of romantic relationships. We also have ludus, which is playful or casual love. We have storge, which is passionless or committed, passionless love. This may be, or the type of love that maybe your grandparents might still experience. They aren't, you know, going at it every single day in the most artless way possible, but they still love each other. We also have committed, pragma, committed or practical love, where there's not that like spark anymore, but you're still committed and there's still practical benefits to cohabitation and therefore love. We also have mania, which is intense or romantic love. This is that spark, that honeymoon period, that intense romance that lasts for only a very short time in a lot of romantic relationships. And then we have agape, that selfless romantic love, where we would do anything for this person, uh, even if it does us harm. So, there are many different types of love, but love is not the only defining characteristic of romantic relationships. The other part is intimacy. This is a feeling of closeness and connection, and that sometimes can only be found in those sorts of romantic relationships. And it also is not defined just by if they are there, but the magnitude by which they are there. So, there we go. Now we talk about online interpersonal relationships, and this is a new type of relationship that is becoming more and more common. We have social information processing theory that is that there are unique cues in online messages to develop relationships. How do we develop relationships with people online through these sorts of unique cues? Maybe the sharing of memes, maybe specific code words, lol, TT, TTYL, talk to you later, those sorts of things. But even there's actually one that's probably one of my favorites is the World of Warcraft. Back in the day, what one of the textbooks had previous version of this textbook what had said was that what people would do is they would lie down on a hill. Their avatars would lay down on a hill together, and therefore would be making love um, through that online communication situation. Then we have hyperpersonal communication, and these are messages that are more personal than face-to-face communication. This may be the person who shares every single thing that went wrong today. They're just very, very highly personal communication. But then when you ask them in person, how's your day going? They say, fine. So we tend to be able to communicate more hyper personally in online situations. And a big reason for that is because we are able to control our communication a lot more in an online situation. That we can post whatever we want and then maybe take down, maybe edit, versus if we were in in a real situation, in a face-to-face situation, then we wouldn't be able to manage as much. What we say is then what is out there. Now that we've talked about the basic types of relationships, now we're going to be discussing why. Why is it that we form into these relationships? Well, proximity. Funny enough, proximity is one of the biggest indicators of which relationships will form into. If we have more interaction with them, therefore we find more attractive qualities about them, and therefore we form into relationships with them. That's why romantic relationships are fairly common among workplaces, that we interact with them more, therefore we start to form into relationships with them more. Also, but this is even talking about friendships and how when we interact with someone more and more and more often, then we tend to form into those relationships and make friend groups within those relationships. Think about your high school friends. That why is it that you formed into a relationship or a friendship with those people? Probably because maybe you had the same classes together, maybe you had some of the same clubs together, maybe you did the same sports together. Then we have attractive qualities. And attractive qualities does not necessarily mean physical attractiveness. It can, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It could be humor. It could be assertiveness. It could be intelligence. But what can happen is that if someone has an attractive quality and then someone maybe has a negative relationship with someone who definitely had that attractive quality, then that may be something that they may avoid in the next relationship. So, attractive qualities, again, are very subjective. Someone may find assertiveness a very attractive quality. Some person may see assertiveness as a not attractive quality, depending on the person and the relationship. Then we have similarity. But James, what about opposites attract? More often than not, similarity tends to attract more often. We look for people who are similar to us because because when we find people who are similar to us, therefore that acts as a means of validation of our own beliefs. So that we look so. Tall people tend to find tall people. Attractive people tend to find attractive people physically. We have Democrats tend to go with Democrats. Republicans tend to go with Republicans. And in general, we tend to look for similarity in our relationships because, on a very deep level, they reflect who we are. And if someone else has that, then we feel validated in our own beliefs or our own behaviors or who we are. Now we move into personal and social needs, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So we have personal and social needs. The main need that we need is companionship, that we constantly strive for companionship and inclusion. And when we do not have this, then we feel lonely, we feel sad, and therefore we look for it. And we may even, just cling on to one just for a relationship, just for the need for inclusion. We also have stimulation. Stimulation is also a need that needs to be satisfied. This can be mental. This may be the person who you're able to talk politics with, or some other high minded ideal about. Then we have emotional. stimulation. And emotional stimulation involves the feeling of love, of happiness, of humor. Those emotional needs are needs as well. And then lastly, we have physical needs. And physical needs can involve um, wanting to eat. I mean, there are. That's why we. That's what form into family relationships. But we also have other physical needs. This could be in friendship groups, such as let's all go for a run together. Let's all go do this or that together. Or even in romantic relationships, there are physical needs that are sometimes need to be met. Then we have achieving goals. This could be either practical or psychological. Practical goals, you know what, I want to buy a house. I can't afford it on my own, therefore, we're going to achieve that goal. Or psychological goals, feeling loved, or even being in a marriage. So now let's talk about, now that we understand why we form into relationships, now we're going to be talking about how we manage relationship dynamics. When we start in a relationship, we engage in uncertainty reduction, which involves uncertainty reduction theory. There are three key ways that we reduce uncertainty about people. But why? Why do we reduce uncertainty? Because uncertainty is a very visceral and very uncomfortable situation for us, and we want to reduce it as much as possible. So we engage in certain uncertainty reduction practices, strategies, and behaviors so that we are able to reduce uncertainty about the situation and therefore be able to predict future interactions with that person. So we can do this by passively we can do this through practical uncertainty reduction means. This could be without interaction, Facebook stalking them, looking at them from a distance, seeing what they're wearing, how they're interacting with others, so that we start to reduce some uncertainty about the situation. We can even start, just in general, looking at them, things like that. Then we have active, but this is where we would then ask other people about the person. This is kind of like the middle school, hey, Steve, ask Susan if she likes me. That is active. Or we could even do, this is also even focused within interviews and how they will ask for a reference that they can then engage in active uncertainty reduction, because there's a lot of uncertainty regarding who they are going to hire and how you're going to fit within that organization. And then we have interactive, and this is direct communication and asking questions. What's your major? What school do you go to? What do you like to do for fun? That sort of interaction reduces uncertainty and therefore makes us more able to predict future interactions, and therefore we feel more comfortable in those future interactions. Some other relational dynamics is social exchange theory, and along with that goes comparison levels and comparison levels of alternative. So we seek out people who can give us rewards that are greater than or equal to the costs we encounter in dealing with them. So in other words, if the rewards outweigh the costs, then the relationship is solid. If the costs outweigh the rewards, then more often than not, the relationship will dissolve. So let's say that I feel love, I feel humor, I feel like, oh my gosh, things are going wonderfully. Oh, you know what? We love each other. We're amazing. But the cost is that, you know what? Sometimes they'll be playing really, really bad music while we're driving to certain places, and that's the worst. I hate that. There's always going to be undesirable outcomes within a relationship, but the relationships outweigh the costs. Therefore, the relationship's going to stay positive. Versus, you know what, this person is always late, they play bad music, they will only want to go to um, clubs, and I hate clubs, versus The reward, they're kind of funny. At that point, the relationship is more likely to dissolve. Now, where it gets a little bit more complicated is comparison level and comparison level of alternatives. Comparison level is the minimum standard of acceptable behavior for the relationship. So, we feel love, therefore, you know what? It's the minimum standard of acceptable behavior. I feel happy. Versus the comparison level of alternatives, which is the comparison between the rewards in a present situation and those one could expect to be receiving from others. So let's say that the comparison level is met. I feel super great about this relationship, but the comparison level of alternatives is not met. I feel like I can find a better relationship out there. Then I'm more likely to leave the relationship, but I was happy in this relationship. Versus if the comparison level of alternatives is bad, and here's where it gets a little bit dark. Maybe, it is an abusive relationship in that I feel like I'm feeling abused mentally, emotionally, even physically. But the comparison level of alternatives is met, that I don't think that I can do better out there, that every relationship's going to be the same. And that's where a lot of people can feel trapped in abusive relationships due to the comparison level of alternatives. And in general, to further break it down, if the comparison level is met, then we are going to be happy. If it's not met, we're going to be unhappy. If the comparison level of alternatives is met, then we will stay. If the outcome is less than the comparison level of alternatives, then we will more likely leave. And that's what that is. Next, we talk about dialectical tensions. And these are tensions that are going to exist and permeate throughout every relationship, but are not things that should be changed, that we have to be able to manage. We have autonomy versus connection, and I like to think of these as the extremes. We are more often than not going to be in these extremes, but it's more or less we're going to be gravitating toward one or the other side. So the extreme of autonomy may be I'm going to be together. I'm going to be on my own. I'm only going to be um, I'm only going to be by myself. I'm going to have my own friends. I'm going to have my own responsibilities. I'm going to have my own um, bed to sleep, place to go, and friend groups to explore on my own. Versus in a connection relationship dynamic, this is where we go do everything together. We go to the same food, we have the same activities, we have all of this, we live together, all of this connection is that other end of the dialectical tensions. We also have openness versus closeness. Openness is this feeling of being able to disclose as much as we can versus closeness, not disclosing as much. And then lastly, we have predictability versus novelty. Predictability is security and a lack of uncertainty, that we know how the interaction is going to go every single time. We're going to do the same things. We aren't going to really deviate from the expectation. But there may need to be some novelty there, that spontaneity, that we may not know what's going to happen, and that's exciting. So we want to be sure that we're trying to find ways to manage and negotiate these within the relationship, and not to expect the other person just to change, instead to try to manage and shift slightly. Next, we have self-disclosure and interpersonal relationships. Self-disclosure is a fundamental part of interpersonal relationships. Without self-disclosure, relationships cannot happen. Because when we communicate ideas, when we disclose, we are communicating trust. We are sharing information, and the person's holding that information, and therefore we trust them with that information. We have social penetration theory. Social penetration theory involves the depth and breadth and frequency of self disclosure. Breadth of information may be things like my favorite color is blue, um, I wear nice clothes. I like the Raiders, and my major is communication studies. Those surface level information, that's breadth of information. Multiple topics, but on very surface level. Versus depth, where we get into one topic and we delve deeply into personal information. And the frequency of disclosure also matters based on openness versus closedness, that dialectical tension. And this is very much where we get into communication privacy management. We do not like to disclose depth of information because it involves a great deal of trust, and we don't trust everyone. It would be ridiculous for us to assume that we would. So we have certain boundaries. And as we delve deeper in depth of disclosure from interface to surface to intimate to personal to core disclosures, we then go through boundaries, and those boundaries, when we go through those boundaries, we engage in boundary turbulence. This is where we start to question if the relationship is worth it, if this amount of disclosure that we're doing is worth the relationship. And a lot of times we say yes, sometimes we say no. If anyone's ever asked too personal of questions for you, maybe that random person on the bus, or maybe that group project member who's asking random things, very in-depth personal questions, then there may be less of a relationship just because there's too much boundary turbulence. But this is very much affected by dialectical tensions. Some people may be totally fine disclosing and have very little boundary turbulence, and therefore showing that openness, dialectical tension, versus people who may not want to disclose at all. Even the smallest disclosures would still have that boundary turbulence. How do we avoid this? Strategic topic avoidance. We can avoid certain topics strategically and therefore not deal with it. But there are benefits in that we don't have to feel uncomfortable. But there's also some detriments that we may not communicate information that either the other person believes, and therefore we could end up connecting on that, or that we may not communicate something that might be a deal breaker for someone else, and therefore the relationship will go on for far longer, and there and once the information does come out, then it's a big challenge to the relationship. Okay, great. We've discussed the interpersonal dynamics regarding interpersonal relationships. Now we're going to be talking about how relationships develop over their life cycles. First, we have the coming together stages where we start to go from two individuals to a social unit, and then and then we have relational maintenance of trying to balance that oneness of the relationship, and then we have coming apart where we start to dissolve again and start to become individuals again. So let's discuss this further. We start with initiating or coming together. This is where you are interested in making contact. Demonstrate that you are a person worth talking to. This may be that first date. What are some of those behaviors that you engage in? Maybe you dress nicely. Maybe you try to be more funny. Maybe you smile a lot. Laugh at their jokes, even if they aren't funny. All of those things. This is a very superficial stage where we may make decisions based on superficial information. Things like, oh, well, they have a nice smile. Or, you know what? They seem like a kind soul. This is a very difficult stage for shy people and is actually one of the big benefits of online technologically mediated communication because due to the ability of hyper-personal communication, we may be more able to communicate information about us, building the relationship further. This is the opening stage of all relationships, this initiating. We don't very often jump past this stage. Then we have coming together. This is where we start experimenting with each other, searching for common ground, small talk, learning about shared interests, allows for auditioning of the other person, setting up tests a little bit. And in general, it's a safe way to ease into a relationship, to not have a lot of deep expectations of the relationship, but to be able to reduce some uncertainty about the relationship and so that you're better able to predict future interactions. Then we have intensifying, and this is this is where the personal relationship develops. This is relational excitement and euphoria stage. This is that honeymoon stage of the relationship. But this stage does not last forever. And then further through this coming together, but this is also where we get into the relational maintenance stage, is identifying as a social unit, social circles. So this person's friends and this person's friends may merge, and partners develop routines and rituals. Sense of obligation of the relationship grows, and requests are more straightforward, and expectations of the relationship are heightened. Then we have bonding. And this involves symbolic public gestures to show the world that the relationship does indeed exist. This could be engagement in marriage. That is a very public gesture to show that the relationship exists, sharing a residence, or even a written verbal pledge. One that's very common these days is becoming Facebook or Instagram official. And by showing this symbolic public gesture, showing that the relationship exists, is a part of that bonding stage. Relationships don't have to be romantic to achieve bonding. What are some ways that we engage in public gestures of friendship with people? Maybe going out and doing the same things. Maybe posting memes together on social media, communicating these public gestures of connection and therefore showing this bonding. And it's an important turning point in the relationship. So we've talked about coming together, relational maintenance in integration. We now are within the relational state maintenance of bonding. And there's also another relational maintenance section where we start to come apart, and this is differentiating. This is reestablishment of our individual identities, not from our to I. That we do need to have some individuality within our relationships. If we were to feel always connected, that can be communicated or perceived as clinginess. And those things communicate a lack of trust, which can then diminish the relationship. So, it is a normal part of relational maintenance to have some individuality. But the key is maintaining commitment while creating space for this individuality. Then further coming apart, and now we're out of the maintenance stages. This is circumscribing. Reducing contact, distinctions are problematic when there are more areas of separation than of integration. So when we start having more individualistic identities versus integrated identities, then that's where we start to form into circumscribing. And now we move into stagnation. And this is where the relationship becomes a hollow shell of its former self. Couples are unenthusiastic and have no sense of joy or novelty in the relationship. And this is very much where we talk about that relational dialectic of predictability versus novelty. that relationships do need some novelty in the relationship. And then one of the last is avoiding. Distance is created, and there are many ways that this distance is created through expressing detachment, avoiding the other person altogether or zoning out, avoiding involvement, ignoring not no touching or even superficial politeness can occur in this stage, showing antagonism, behaving in a hostile way, treating the other people as lesser. This very much speaks to and is very much reflected by a lot of the destructive conflict styles, which we will be discussing later. Things like communicating a superiority over other people, that very much is further development of this coming apart and avoiding. And then lastly, mentally disassociating, thinking about other person as less capable or unimportant. This creates a vicious cycle where if one person is experiencing detachment, then what does the other person do? They probably reciprocate in kind. And then lastly, the very last part where all relationships will eventually go is to terminating. Summary dialogues of where the relationship has gone and a desire to disassociate. This can be either very short or drawn out. This can be 2-second conversation or 2-word conversation, we're done, or full drawn out conversation. This could also be the death of a person in the relationship. But termination is a learning experience. And um, when we do terminate relationships, we should start having those summary thought process of what were the good parts of the relationship? What were the poor parts of the relationship? How did I contribute to the poor parts? How did I contribute to the good parts? And how can I improve from here? So those are all of the stages of Knapp's model of group development. And by understanding these better, we'll be able to better improve how we interact in these relationships. And there are certain limits to this developmental model. Communication can ebb and flow in relationships, and this model suggests that relationships exhibit only the most dominant trait of just one of the 10 stages at any given time, but there are elements of other stages that are usually present in each and every one of these stages. And even an example of this could be that someone may think that they are coming together while the other person with the same behavior could feel like they are coming apart. So we want to be sure that so now that we understand a little bit more of our interpersonal relationships, we'll be better able to communicate in these relationships and have more fulfilling relationships. With that, that concludes this chapter. Have a wonderful rest of your day.